First of all, thank you to Latino and to the Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel, this amazing panel with these three voices that have been from different angles working on democracy, on the concept of democracy, on seeing how democracy and democratization is going forward. For Democracia Abierta is very interesting to be here as well. We've been publishing already for 2 years as an independent media, and we have also one of our focus is political experimentation. We have been working on that. We have been giving voice to a lot of practitioners, of activists, of people on the ground who have been, who are working on this issue of experimentation and innovation, and also with people who are active in politics that are also trying to implement their innovation. So it's very important also to have the other side, the academic side, the conceptual side, and then the conceptualization and organization of an array of very diverse creatures that are on the ground, and only the academics or the experts who can look in a more, let's say, rational way, what sometimes is very emotional, because these people who are on the ground trying to innovate, trying to participate, trying to deliberate, trying to put forward the democracy are very, very much on the ground, very much engaged, but sometimes they lose the big picture. So having the big picture will be a good thing. So my role here is only to moderate, and I'm very pleased to give the floor to Professor Morlino. Then, thank you, Professor.
Thank you. The podium, as I have a presentation here that we want to show you. Democracy and its critics. This is a famous course, used to be for many years at Yale. And one great professor that gave this course is Robert Dahl. But actually, and I was a student of him in this course, but actually this is also an homage not only to Dahl, but to a point, to an idea. Innovation comes from the criticism, comes from the failure. Politicians are against innovations. No way. Politics is for continuity, stability, inertia, resilience. Years ago, I have to tell you this. 5 years ago, I was invited as a keynote speaker in the opening ceremony of my university. And I don't know if the rector ever regretted this invitation, because my talk was on innovation and on the perspective of constitutional reform in Italy. And I explained why in Italy there would have been no reform at all. And of course, as in the audience, there were a few ministers, there were a few politicians, other people. I felt largely, I was regretting that in my view I spoke the truth. In fact, immediately after me, the rector asked a vice rector, now the rector of the university, Luis, in Rome, that was a minister during Monti government, to say something and to say that eventually I did not mean what I meant. So I tried to find a solution. But the truth is this one. Politics is against innovation. If you go into, for example, economics, scholars of economics, scholars in management, they have a totally view about innovation. Innovation is always positive. Even the crisis is a positive opportunity for innovation. So we have a totally different view. Innovation in politics comes out of the failures. One of the reasons of this, because particularly democratic innovation is related to ideas, to normative notion. But actually, there is more than this. And this is a key point that we have to learn and to keep in mind. In the 60s, in Latin America, when there was the thrust for innovation, there was a coup d'etat. Once we have a totally legitimated democracy, so within a different civil, cultural context, then we come and we have room for institutional innovation that anyway we don't like, and policy innovation that we anyway we can try to accept if confronting, coping with the real issues. But again, the problem is that because also behind innovation, there is a criticism. There are critics to democracy, because democracy, and from this point of view, we are speaking of democracy, not polyarchy, as Robert Dahl had in mind, as actually a normative model. Scholars, for example, this is a set of some of the most recurrent normative model of democracy, or this is the result of our research a couple of years ago with Hans-Peter Krisi, the European Social Survey, where we found that Europeans, the survey was done in 30 European countries, the Europeans in these 30 countries has basically three normative notions of democracy: liberal democracy, particularly in Northern Europe, social democracy, Southern Europe, particularly some of Eastern Europe, and a very widespread notion of direct democracy in a minoritarian way, basically all over Europe. So from these normative models, from the point of view of scholars, or even from the point of view of people, we have the possibility of looking at the criticism, not only to the quality of democracy, as I say here, but the criticism, or in terms of procedure, in terms of content, or in terms of result. When accepting the 5 dimension that Tammy was showing to you, when we consider the critical joints of a democracy. And here is the key point. That is, there is a larger literature, there is a larger kind of different publications in the media where more or less these 6 aspects, these 6 features are identified as the critical joints in a democracy. Where today, within a context of a legitimation, we can go ahead with innovation. So the problem of corruption, and of course is very, very relevant, very important. Also, Pedro was referring to this earlier on in his presentation. Actually, Pedro, you gave me the idea of speaking about innovation, politics against innovation, because when you presented the project, you said, as there is a failure everywhere, we are open innovation. Innovation, this is the idea that a positive reaction to the failure, that this innovation brings a better situation. So, first critical joint in the problem of integrity, corruption. Then typically, there is a very large literature that is also related to the literature on direct democracy. David Hartman published a very good book about direct democracy on this problem. It is on all the limits in implementing representation that are also related to the existence or the weakening or the fading away of the parties. And there are some table that Tammy showed to you in terms of the role of the party, where the left-right is a little bit more confused, but it's part of this kind of weakness. Other key point, the electoral accountability, where we see clear, you know the mechanism of electoral accountability. a justification, a reason for some behavior by politician, media that reflect this kind of reasons, and the assessment of the citizens. As you may see, if you look at these different steps, you immediately see how this kind of mechanism can be largely subverted. This is one of the most, in addition to this, is one of the most relevant relevant weakness for accountability. In addition to this, you may remember the idea of Guillermo O'Donnell of delegative democracy, that is, while the right of voting is an intermittent, is a discontinuous right, when we come to the accountability, it's better to count on the relationships that are relationships among elite anyway. So there are relationships where the people is totally outside, is totally ignorant of what's actually happened. The exclusion in terms of decision making. This is another aspect that's been always criticized. And this, if you remember the table by Tammy on the policy cycle, Tammy showed you how the participation of the people was declining along the cycle, and that is one of the interesting empirical results of her analysis. The other key aspect that's been traditional also in the European left is the idea of this procedure, democracy as a set of procedures actually without content. And of course, this for example was totally against Robert Dahl in Democracy and His Critics. If you remember, there is a page of Democracy of His Critics by Bob Dahl where he stresses how a right procedure imply a strong relevant content. That is how related are content and procedure. And the other connected point is the famous, in a sense, Bobbio Sartori statement in terms of procedural relationship of priority between freedom and equality. You cannot have any kind of social economic equality if the civil rights, the political rights are not respected. This is a key element of discussion, but if you remember, within the left, within the Marxist left, if we come to European experience, there has been always this idea of procedure only formal aspects, so the criticism. Another aspect of criticism is here. Another aspect of innovation, or possibility of innovation, is here. Responsiveness, where responsiveness is attempt of replying at the needs of the citizens that sometimes is only declared without any kind of implementation. In other occasions, does not take, for example, responsibility if we come to Europe, even with vis-a-vis third countries. You may remember the debate with Greece and so on. So this, as you see, 7 critical joints are the point that are at the beginning of development of innovation, along the 5 dimensions that Tammy was mentioning. Again, and I state this is a point that I think Tammy would subscribe in terms of people participation, in debate, direct voting, and other way. So in this way, we have the different specific innovation Tammy was describing in her presentation. Now, the point is, okay, how do we explain them? Why one kind of innovation rather than another one? One type, why we intervene on institutional innovation rather than and policy innovation? And here the hypothesis I present to you is that we need to consider 2 different intervening variables. Innovation usually comes from elite, from politicians. Tammy again presented a clear indication. about this. But even the elite has to take into account not only the social context. All of you, I think, know what are the poderes poderosos. But also some aspect of the culture. The elite, the political elite, reflect the culture in the kind of innovation that is going to present. Of course, also, and above all, I would say, in a reactive way. The other and so on. The other intervening factor is related to the immediate problems as a result, as a necessity to cope with specific pressing issues such as poverty, such as economic crisis, such as others. These are the two intervening variables that you have to consider when explaining innovation, when you have the awareness of what is the original innovation. In this case, once we are within a democratic country, within a legitimated democracy, then the 7 joints that I show you are the origins of innovation. But then you need the intervening variables. My last point, I think I took my 15 minutes, was that I was glad that Wolfgang mentioned this problem of the crisis. And I think you are totally right. Maybe it's too much to talk about crisis. Even in Southern Europe, we should, for example, distinguish what is democratic crisis and what is democratic worsening, what is democratic decline, if you would like to use another, to adopt another term, but this recurrent common reference to the crisis, that of course for us was also a reference to the past, to the crisis and breakdown, I think maybe was too much in this more recent literature on economic crisis and political crisis. Thank you very much.
Now the floor is for Professor Warren. Thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you, Francisca. Thanks to Tammy for this amazing project. I'm just overwhelmed with how interesting and deep this is. Thank you, of course, to Wolfgang and the WBZ for supporting her, and thanks, of course, also to the Open Society for their forward-looking vision in this area. I want to use my couple of minutes, maybe 12 or 15 minutes, to talk about the drivers of democratic innovation around the world, with Latin America representing, of course, an important part of this big picture. Now, the big picture, I think, and I hope I'm not being too hopeful here, is that we may be seeing another transformation of democratic governance that could be as important as the development of representative party-based democracies that developed out of the universal franchise from the mid-1800s up through 1950, 1960. The transformation, of course, as you now know, involves hundreds of thousands of new channels of citizen involvement in government, often, though, outside the more visible politics of electoral representation. The processes vary widely in form, as Tammy's presentation and research shows, including citizens' advisory panels, citizens' juries, citizen assemblies, of course, participatory budgeting, national councils in Brazil, deliberative polling, new forms of e-democracy, new and innovative uses of social media, and that it's a very long list. The LATINNO Project is along with Participedia, the first to begin to try to document this transformation and to begin to produce something of a map. Now, I think that there are kind of 3 broad structural factors that are driving these innovations, which is why I think they will continue. They will become more extensive, deeper, and so on. Now, first, electoral democracy produces broad mandates for government, but it is not generating the legitimacy necessary for governing policy-specific areas, from environmental regulation to urban planning, from school reform to employment policy, from trade to immigration. Parties run on general platforms. Governing, however, is a somewhat different matter. Every area of governance brings into being new constituencies that don't necessarily and often do not correspond to electoral constituencies. So it's one thing to elect a party that promises to invest in infrastructure generally, but it's quite another matter to build a new train station, as in the case of Stuttgart 21, with which I'm sure you are all familiar. Second, in a globalized world, effects flow across borders, generating social justice issues to which elected elites have too often failed to respond. Capturing the benefits of global trade, for example, erodes the sovereignty of nations, which also means eroding popular sovereignty, particularly the kind of popular sovereignty that's achieved through electoral democracy. Third, citizens are increasingly vocal and better organized. The density of civil society organizations, certainly in the developed democracies, but elsewhere as well, begin to increase rapidly in the late 70s through the 1980s. And they have the capacity to resist and undermine policies and projects, even when these are imposed by elected governments. Again, think Stuttgart 21. Or they can use electoral processes to make the point that they are resisting or they're angry, but often in ways that are too crude, too angry, too destructive, as I think the Brexit and Trump votes demonstrated, as does the increasing strength of insurgent populist parties in Europe. These developments are testing the limits of electoral democracy. As Wolfgang suggested, we should all hope, we have to hope that electoral democracy is here to stay, because there's simply no better ways of selecting, constituting, and removing governments. But we need to find ways of producing new forms of democratic responsiveness and new ways of using the capacities and intelligence of citizens. And there is now some urgency before citizens lose faith completely in electoral democracy. We need to supplement electoral democracy with democratic innovations. Now, the processes of democratic supplementation have been developing quite rapidly, but we need to know where to look. Elections are, of course, highly visible events. They focus on broad and general programmatic visions. Most democratic innovations, though, are specific, incremental, driven by projects, policies, and problems of government. Sometimes they're local and quite focused, such as Citizens' Assembly on Neighborhood Planning. Sometimes they are national and even about constitutional issues, as with Iceland's recent crowdsourced constitutional process. Sometimes they focus on basic social justice issues, as with Brazil's participatory budgeting in poor favelas. Democratic innovations are not always, but very often created outside of electoral processes, driven by government agencies and ministries. So I was very interested in Tammy's data on this particular point, where you have bureaucrats just trying to do their job, right? Just trying to focus on their constituencies, just trying to get a little bit of governance done. And in the process, they innovate democratically. So we kind of need to look in places that we haven't been looking for democracy. The processes are often advisory to established institutions rather than directly empowered, although there are a small number of very interesting exceptions to this. Now, beyond the general idea that democratic innovations should supplement electoral democracy, Our more specific expectations will depend on the goals that we should want them to accomplish, as well as the nature of the issues and the context. Both participatory budgeting and the national councils in Brazil, for example, were kind of ideologically motivated and designed for participatory purposes, to get as many people involved in decision-making as possible. Participatory budgeting aimed at a more just distribution of basic municipal services. And other kinds of processes are designed for example, epistemic purposes, to make better decisions. These kinds of processes almost always include learning and deliberation in advance of policy recommendations or decisions or reports, seeking to combine the common wisdom of citizens with experts' knowledge of an issue, with, for example, citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, citizen reference panels, and so on being examples of this type of goal. Still other processes, as Tammy's typology emphasized, are designed for better representation, usually by populating a body through near-random or stratified sampling. In this way, engaging a broader range of voices than would be the case with bodies that are populated by self-selected processes, where, for example, open forums like town hall meetings and elections are two examples of self-selected processes, and they have representation deficits as a result. This said, there will always be trade-offs in goals. A process that's designed for maximum inclusion, for example, will often fail to be a good representative process, as self-selection favors those with more education, social status, and income. Yet processes designed for good representation may exclude many of these same kinds of people. Processes designed for good epistemic results require investments of time and organization, which will tend to exclude people who don't have that much spare time in their lives. So it will disfavor, for example, young working people, and maybe especially young working mothers, while favoring retired people whose kids are out of the house and they've got a lot of time in their hands, introducing another kind of bias. So these are examples of the kind of design trade-offs that we will always find within democratic innovations. There are some kinds of processes that are older and, in fact, rarely work very well. For example, so-called town hall meetings. This kind of process is heavily biased toward the angry and the well-organized. People show up, as we know from post-Trump town hall meetings, to yell at their elected representatives. Likewise, direct democracy, the direct democracy of ballot initiatives and referendums, sometimes they're okay. Often they mobilize the angry and the ignorant, as was, I think, clearly the case with Brexit. So while trust in elected elites has been in decline, the opposite is also true, and we need to pay attention to this. Elites don't trust the people, right? Even the elected elites don't trust the people who elect them. And why should they, right? The kind of supplementary processes are processes that are highly oppositional and often quite destructive. The Latino Project is documenting the many different kinds of alternatives that exist, right? And there are many kinds of alternatives. Elected elites very often don't know what these alternatives are. In Participedia, we have, this is a crowdsourced project, which is slightly different than Tammy's. We have over 200 entries in an area we call methods, right? These are different kind of ways of doing democratic or participatory innovations. There probably aren't 200 uniquely different methods. there are lots of different tactics and methods that are combined and recombined to produce diversity. But it's still an indication of the many different kinds of possibilities out there, and the huge amount of democratic inventiveness that is coming to light and that is happening, especially in the electoral democracies, but also in some other surprising cases. So there's a huge amount of inventiveness in especially deliberative institutions in China, in an authoritarian country, probably driven by the Communist Party trying to design methods of uptake that won't drive them into electoral democracy, right? So they are inventing new ways of doing democracy to avoid electoral democracy. I don't endorse that, but it's a very interesting development. Not all of these innovations are well designed, of course, but where they are well designed, they should be able to produce two-way trust between the people and decision makers, increase legitimacy, increase the quality of public policies, and hopefully do a number of other things as well. More generally, then, we need to be thinking about complementarities, complementarities between democratic innovations and electoral democracy, complementarities among and between different kinds of democratic innovations. Some other kinds of old institutions can be supplemented in ways to upgrade them. So I just said something not very nice about direct democracy, but it doesn't have to be that way. In the US state of Oregon, for example, Oregon has developed what they call a CIR, a Citizens Initiative Review, which involves a citizens jury-like process of 20 to 24 randomly selected people who then are tasked with learning about debating and recommending a voting position on ballot initiatives that have been put forth by petition. So in this case, you have a citizens jury that is advisory not to government, but to the people, right? So it's really quite an interesting innovation. This has been tracked by some clever researchers, and they're finding that people are learning more before they go into the ballot, the voting booth. And where the citizens jury arrives at consensus, the citizens of Oregon are beginning to use these panels as a trusted information proxy, often following their lead. Again, you have a democratic innovation which is upgrading direct democracy, which is not ever going to go away, certainly in the Western US or Switzerland or other kinds of places. Now, the broader research problem, to come back to the Latino Project, is to begin to map and understand this rapidly growing domain of democratic innovations. We just need to know what's out there. We need to know what kinds of processes work best for specific problems and issues, for specific goals under specific circumstances. We need to map this domain. We need to explain why the processes are developing as they are. And finally, and this is the kind of, this is where we really want to get to, we need to assess their contributions to democracy and good governance. But because of the high levels of diversity, it's a really difficult field to study systematically. One of the analogies that I often use is, if you think about the analogy to a field guide to birds, right? With electoral democracy, there's quite a bit of diversity, but we kind of know what birds are out there, right? We know what species exist. But with democratic innovations, we don't have a field guide to the species. we just have a collection of sightings, right? And our problem now is to kind of knit these sightings together into something that begins to look like a field guide to democratic innovations. And Tammy and her team have made a huge contribution, continuing to make a huge contribution to our field guide to democratic innovations. The broader importance, of course, and we hope that democratic innovations will contribute to deepening and strengthening democracy, and that on the academic side we can contribute to understanding and assessing these things. While there has been in the past and continues to be a lot of talk about democracy in crisis, I'm not fond of this. I think there is, and I agree with Wolfgang on this, there are challenges and problems. I think that our world today actually has more democratic potentials than ever before, but our political problem is to ensure that democratic innovations develop quickly enough and deeply enough and at a high enough quality to address the increasingly troubling deficits in electoral democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we've had two visions from the academia, but now we are going to have a vision more from the practitioner side, from somebody who has been working to implement and to foster democracy and specifically social democracy on the ground. And so I give the floor to Svenka Blanke. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Tammy, for the invitation to the WZB, also for the invitation and the Open Society, and to be part of this debate. Actually, when Tammy asked me to participate, I was quite happy to be invited to a presentation of a more optimistic project, because lately, as already Pedro said, talking about Latin America in the last year or so was always about the turnover, the crisis, and so this was a welcome alternative. And I'm very happy to talk a little bit about some of my ideas about it. I think that the project is not only interesting, it's different, it's necessary, it's thought-provoking, it's offering very important detailed information, and it's very inspiring. And it's not just that, it invites us to think about and discuss Latin American democracies and beyond. There is always a certain way to see the region from the European perspective, and I think that way always needs to be questioned, and this project helps to question these general ways of seeing a region, always with all these challenges that exist, of course, but it adds a positive twist to the current and very hot debates about the crisis of democracy, which is, I also think, for the region of Latin America, a crisis of representation, much more than of democracy per se. I would maybe exclude Brazil and Venezuela from this right now, because the question of one of the pillars, as Wolfgang Merkel said, the control of those who govern, maybe is not currently given, but that leads us to a very long discussion. My role in this panel is that of a practitioner, a representative, so to speak, of a civil society or in an organization that works constantly towards the objective of promoting and deepening democracy and social justice, not just in Germany, but worldwide. And in Latin America, we've been very active with our partners for decades already. The Ebert Foundation has currently 17 offices. We're operating 22 projects in the region. And we work basically, for those who do not know us so much, with political parties from the left or the center left, with unions, civil society, and representatives from governments. And we are quite convinced that participation enhances democracy, because this is why we support unions, trade unions, because without trade unions and without the participation to enhance democracy at the workplace, we wouldn't have an enhancement of economic democracy, a very important part of our work. We have also been involved with some of the cases in the database of Latino. We have supported some cases. We have helped some to bring about, or some parts to bring about, and invited also representatives of some cases. But some of them, of course, we also see critical, and most of them we've never heard of. I'm very impressed. 2,400 cases is quite a scope. And of course, a question that we as practitioners would like to be answered is, which institutional designs affects best the quality of democracy? And I want to now speak a little bit about Latin America, then about the importance of the project, and raise some questions at the very end. I would say that Latin American democracies today, apart from all the problems, are still more stable than 30 or 40 years ago, when we had the times of the military dictatorships and the civil wars. But they're very young plants that need to be gardened, taken care of, and often, well, too often, a lot of politicians and decision makers dry them out or rip some parts out. So Latin American democracies have severe challenges, especially considering, and I think this is something that is different from other regions of the so-called Global South. The last 30 years have been officially democratic, and considering that apart from a lot of innovations that have been taking place, these challenges still exist. And Latin American citizens, we've seen this in the last few years, have become very impatient with the outcomes and the results. Some call it even hyper-participation. All the citizens going out on the streets demanding better infrastructure, better education, better public policies and structures. And they know their rights, and they defend them clearly. And what was tolerable in the past is not tolerable in the present. Talking about corruption, mismanagement, poor results. We see it in Chile, we see it in Brazil, in Venezuela, Central America, Mexico. And I think it also has to do with some of the broken promises Wolfgang Merkel talked about in the European context, and you could also apply that to the Latin American context. This is why knowledge about positive elements of the Latin American political system are so necessary. Because it's one of the regions, I would say, where the society, the civil society is so active traditionally as well as currently, that pushes and fosters topics of relevance and thereby helping the democracies to blossom. Topics that more traditional representatives would not pick up. And so social movements, civic activism, civil society are often the corrective element for reforms or for the new topics. The LATINNO Project shows quite impressively the dimension of the many expressions, ideas put into practice, projects and programs that are trying to enhance participation and specific objectives within the society. And I think it is so important because it shows the scope of innovations in a very different setting than the European. It is important to overcome also this north-south division of knowledge transmission. And it is important because the project shows the dimension beyond citizen budgeting. The key word here is Porto Alegre, from which we all have learned quite a bit, including to introducing such elements in Europe. But that's not it. We see that there is so much out there. And it is important, and because Tammy also underlines it, that these programs are not made up in competition or against the structure of liberal democratic models, but in addition, as a complement to the representative model. A fact that is very important in the Latin American context because Latin American democracies are often not that representative of the interests and needs of all, and especially the most marginalized groups. But unfortunately, not in all cases this is the case. We watch and we look at Venezuela or other countries. I think we could debate whether such also innovative projects and programs are not or were not generated in order to sidestep the procedures that are in the way of a certain political project. Latino is also very important for practitioners, representatives of parties, politics, civil societies, international NGOs and funding organizations, in order to see what already exists, to compare, to ask more concrete questions about certain developments or certain obstacles within the system. It makes it easier to decide more precisely what to support, what to look at, what questions to ask. and to see the different angles or compare what else already exists. There is, as a matter of fact, very little knowledge. And you talked about the field guide, and I think this is exactly what makes it so important. And as I know Mexico a little bit better, I checked a few cases, and I pick up on the topic of the Social Council of the National Women Institute in Mexico. And one asks about the procedures and the debates and finds out that it is important because it brings together women and women representatives from very different backgrounds and from 2 or 3 different political spheres. But that it is not initiated, that's on the positive side, so to speak, but that it has not initiated one important reform project since 2001, and that the situation of women, of course, has also not improved. So we have a project, we have a program that adds space of debate, consensus, citizen representation, but in the context, maybe not more. But it gives us some more facts, and I think we can thereby understand much better such a program. When we look at Uruguay, on the other hand, very different cases pop up, and some of them, such as the Consejos Barriales neighborhood council, have a very high impact, reach a very high number of citizens, and it proves very much the relationship between governments and citizens' demands. So what I want to say is we need to put and distinguish and put these programs into context, of course, a task that is up to specialists and political representatives, taking a look at the maps and then making their decision. Also, it has been mentioned that Latin America is a young democracy and therefore open to experimentation. But unfortunately, it's also a region with tendencies of abuse of power for other purposes than the pure aim of offering elements of more social justice or participation, especially on behalf of the executive power. So this leads me to a very important question that I have. Can participatory elements and designs be effective and inclusive in poorly functioning democracies and in exclusionary and unequal societies, where you have a tendency to sidetrack traditional representative channels like parliaments or law? I do not have an answer to that, but I want to raise that question because I think it's important in this context. Currently, we are witnessing an era in which Latin American citizens know their rights much better and they push their rights. That is a huge and important factor. And it is a result, I would put this thesis on the table, of a lot of these cases that are to be found in the Latino map. But another fact that we've seen in the region with left-wing or with right-wing governments is clientelism that remains a very common factor in Latin American political systems. And I think it is very important that we have to understand better how participatory channels function in highly clientelistic democratic systems, where the relationships between representatives and clients are very unequal. These are some of the questions I have. I have no answers, and I think that this project helps us to understand much better what has been going on, but also to ask the right questions to find out more. Sometimes working in the practical field of democracy can be very frustrating because you go 3 steps forward, 2 back, you go 1 forward, 2 back, 3 back, and so forth. But being able to lean on a map, a database that offers vast information on real cases and projects, will help to define and evaluate one's own, but also one's project partner's frame of action. And Latino in this sense is definitely various steps forward. But as a representative of a political organization, I want to close with a more political statements. That is, Latin America needs, of course, democratic elites and representatives, young and new activists pushing values of transparency into the representative systems. It needs a real reform of social economic structures. Otherwise, the democracy will not be enhanced through new channels and models. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Svenka, for your powerful presentation. We have not much time for questions, but before giving opening to the floor, I will maybe ask a question to the panel. We have been talking about the political experimentation and innovation, and that in Latin America this happens more than in other places, so because of a number of reasons. Pedro might mention some, but now we are witnessing this change of the tide in a way. So we had this pink tide for the last decade or more, and now we see some political changes that are sending some warnings about how much of all these innovations that have been taking place are going to continue, or they're going to slow down or stop or to reverse. One finding of the research, where we saw that slide, that says that political innovation has been also on the right as much as on the left in political parties. So my question is, not only the innovation, but the quality of innovation, or the results of the innovation, is it depending on the political vision, or is only it's the product of government by itself? So how do you see this in the context of the crisis or potential crisis that somebody of you say there is not such a crisis in democracy? How do you see that in Latin America in these new times?
You're asking me? That's yeah. No,
I was asking the panel, but
yeah. Should I start?
Yeah.
I think it's. No, I think it's of course, it's a very relevant question. And if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, of course, it was the left or the center left that pushed these innovative projects. And I would have said, yes, my feeling is that they do enhance the quality of democracy. Probably not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. But we're in the year 2017, and I would question such a feeling nowadays, because of course we had all these innovations. We had the golden decade, so to speak, in our point of view, the golden decade of left-wing or center-left governments in many countries. And besides the innovations, besides these projects, besides a lot of new social policies, citizens are demanding more, which on the one hand is very positive because they know their rights, and so they just go a step further, and they do say quite clearly what is not functioning and that there needs more to be done. But on the other hand, probably a lot what was introduced did not fulfill the demands. And so it would be very interesting to see exactly which were those programs that really responded best to such demands. But this is a huge task, but the database helps us, I think, to have a starting point.
Yes, so I think there's sort of a two-pronged answer, and I think it goes along with much of what's been said. I do think that innovations will continue because of this legitimacy gap that is generated structurally by the complexity of governing, and this is something that I think holds across regimes. Wherever you have complexity, electoral democracy is going to be tapped out and require supplements. The next step, though, and we're not here yet, although you're framing it very nicely, we need to look at the way these innovations are functioning within broader encompassing systematic contexts. And we can do more here. We could begin to do a typology, for example, between relatively corrupt regimes and non-corrupt, between clientelistic regimes and non-clientelistic regimes, between authoritarian regimes and relatively clean electoral democracy. democracies. And it's likely that these innovations are doing different things in each type of context. In some kinds of contexts, and I mentioned China, it may be that these innovations actually, they soften authoritarianism, but also may strengthen it. And this is, we need to keep our eye on this. This is probably also the case with clientelism and kind of softer forms of authoritarianism in other kinds of contexts. So a lot of theoretical work to be done. But we can't quite do that theoretical work without knowing what's out there. And this is, again, why this mapping project is so important.
I think I have two points I would like to make. The first point, left-right. Francesc, Wolfgang, Tami, we all know that if we had said left-right on Latin America, about Latin America, say in the 70s or the 80s, the reply would be, what do you say? There is no the meaning of left-right in Latin America vis-a-vis the traditional meanings that were the European meanings of left-right. Today, it's true, in the debate of Latin America, there is this idea of left-right. Basically, the left in terms of equality, of socio-economic equality, or of fighting the inequality. But the key point is that some of the politicians, some what we may call neo-populist leaders, that are in favor of this, they don't believe in civil rights. They don't believe in political rights. When you were mentioning Venezuela, not today, Venezuela of even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Venezuela was no longer a democracy. It was what we consider an hybrid regime, as Chavez had not in mind the liberal democratic regime. So innovation is always to do with civil rights, is always to do with political rights, is not only have to do with, say, reply or look for social rights, fight against inequality. This is also the reason why, in my view, Tami, you find that kind of result, that is attention to the centrist or rightist party to innovation, because they declare they pay more attention to the, say, liberal democracy, some of the procedural aspect. So this is my partial reply, Francesc, to you. But I would like to address another point that I think Svenja made, and I think it's very relevant. And the point is this one. What is the meaning of participation within a clientelistic context? And this is a very relevant point. And here, actually, we are to talk, Svenja, about the change of the meaning of participation, where participation is active participation, is no longer passive or participation, is no longer a kind of subject participation. And this is something that, so in analyzing participation, we have to look which kind of participation we have. And this may make the difference in our analysis. But of course, there are differences between country and within the same countries. Brazil usually is a country where there are, in some state, a strong participation, a strong even traditional participation. There are other states where there is virtually no traditional participation at all. And on the whole, we consider Brazil as a country where there is participation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the conclusion is that innovation does not always mean social progress. So you can innovate in the other sense as well, in order to repress or to stop or to, and then we have seen even here in Europe, some examples of political activism. Or let's take Hungary, for instance. You will say that through different policy initiatives, you will have some innovation on the ground, but this innovation does not mean that they are going into the direction of openness and the direction of inclusiveness and in the direction of closing the gap in inequality. Now we have some minutes for taking some questions from the ground, and then we will have to reserve some time for the closing remarks. So we will grab 2 or 3 questions together, and then please stand up and identify yourself. Wait for the mic.
Okay, thank you. Does it work? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Katarzyna Klimowicz, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Warsaw, and I do my research about the idea of participatory and deliberative democracy and the way it is implemented by new political movements such as Podemos, Barcelona en Comú, Movimento 5 Stelle, or pirate parties. My question is directed to the coordinator of the project and people that were involved. If you have also cases that are partly or completely outside of the state structures that were launched by new political movements in Latin America, or citizen-led urban movements that go beyond this traditional dichotomical division on left and right. And my question comes from the doubt whether traditional parties established in the system of representative democracy, if they can really implement innovative solutions, and whether they really look forward for democratization of the political system and hierarchical governance structures, and how to distinguish real participation and real deliberation from pseudo participation, since as if I remember well, most of the not all the decisions were binding in these processes. So what comes to my mind, that also the idea of participation, which is so vague, could be used by old politicians just to maintain their power and the status quo, but using this slogan of participation, like just showing how democratic and innovative they are, but actually, I know that it's hard to measure real intentions, and but I was wondering about the authenticity and how to distinguish facade from authentic participation in this. How innovative and democratic actually are these democratic innovations. What also comes to
your
my
question
mind,
is then, because you're making more a statement than a question, please.
Yes. So just to refer to what Professor Leonardo Morino said, that politics can be against innovation. So I would risk a statement that actually real innovations are from the bottom, not from the top. And that most of these projects, ideas came from the state government institutions, just can show how our systems are actually centralized. Thank you.
You were having a question? Yeah.
Well, thanks for the presentation. Okay. Yeah. So my name is Ari Salgueiro. I'm a PhD student, and I was wondering. I would like to ask Professor Warren because I think that's the systems approach that is how there's kind of the framework that you were presenting in the background. So I was wondering first that you say that projects have different possible focuses. Some of them are more like inclusive, and they might have a problem with epistemic conditions. So I was wondering, well, if every kind of innovation has a different focus and has a different or serves a different function, how can you make an overall index of quality of democracy? Because it can be that the epistemic, that's as an epistemic solution for some problems, you might find necessary for more disturbing and even maybe undemocratic innovations. So I was wondering that. So that'd be my question.
And we have a last question here, Wolfgang.
I would like to take up the question mentioned by Mark and Svenja, which I would call the contextual question. I think one of the strengths of the data gathered by the wonderful Latino team could be to find out which contexts, which institutional and societal contexts make democratic innovations democratic or undemocratic. So it's certainly a difference if you have exactly the same democratic innovation in Uruguay and Costa Rica, and you have it in Nicaragua or under the present regime in Venezuela. So therefore, the strength of the data could be a more small-end comparison than the wholesale comparisons of Latin America. The only question I still, or this is a major one, we may start to solve it, is a causality question. Very crucial in the whole data collection is the overall question: which impact do these democratic innovations have on the democratic quality of the whole regime? But how can we isolate other factors, improving, for example, the political responsiveness or political inclusion, and can trace it back to one or two specific democratic innovations? So we have to isolate from all the other factors which can impact on such an improved accountability or something else. This is certainly something we have to keep in mind, and this is what we have to think about.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Any of you want to reply? Response? Yeah. Maybe Tammy, you want?
I think so. It is also not fair with people who were earlier on. But I think for the round table.
Okay.
Well, the last question by Wolfgang, of course, is a very relevant question. And the reply methodologically is fairly simple. Empirically could be much more complex. There is, from a methodological problem, it depends on the level of causality. That is, you cannot talk about how responsiveness improved considering a specific innovation in a given country. You can say, consider a specific innovation of a given country, how an aspect of responsiveness related to that specific innovation can be improved. That is, say, how bureaucracy in this department, in this branch, is improved. Or you can do in a different way. That is, consider responsiveness as a whole, and then consider a set of different innovation that you categorize in connection with the responsiveness. So, I mean, methodologically, it's very simple. Empirically, it's your problem.
A very short answer to Wolfgang. That's a nice reformulation of the second question, but I think we're counting on the WZB to organize a conference on precisely this question, which is the next place we need to go to this contextual question. On explanation, it's going to be a while before we get to the level that we will need in the quantitative world, which is in part why we need to rely on qualitative methodologies in this area for some time to come. Process tracing, ethnographies, histories, and so on. We don't want to underestimate the causal stories that you can tease out of those. Of course, where we want to get to is generalization that has a strong quantitative source, but for that we will need to know, for example, the kind of population that is being sampled by the Latino Project or by Participatia. We don't know what those populations look like yet. We don't have any control group, so I think it's going to be a while. One quick comment on the first question, which is very well taken. I think there is a cycle of between protest and work outside of government, which produces, sort of civil society veto capacities. Very often, governments respond with, I'm still looking for a good word for this, but with a process that they will call democratic, but when you dig into it, it's not very. They're hoping to generate legitimacy without giving anything up. So it's the democracy equivalent of greenwashing in the environmental area, democracy washing. Very often, nobody's fooled by these, and especially the people who are outside pressing and vetoing. So it's often a second cycle that begins to generate what are sort of truly democratic innovations. I don't know of any papers that have been written on this cycle, but I would bet that it's quite generalizable.
Just 2 sentences. I'm, as a practitioner, already happy with this database because it gives us something to work with, what is out there. And if there is the next step where answers can be found, so to speak, how in the contextual question, I think we would be even more happy because we need these knowledges in order to work back in the field and support, in our understanding, the right projects. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So for the conclusion, I will say, I don't know, if innovations encourage innovation, now we know that in Latin America there's a lot of innovation, that we have the capacity of looking at it and how it happens. So I hope this project will encourage more innovation and, of course, the progress of democracy and democracy and a better society in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers for this great discussion, and thanks for everybody's interest. And there were some very, very important questions raised in the discussion right now. We unfortunately don't really have that much time to discuss them right now, but we are going to be very happy if you can stay a bit longer, because we're having a small reception afterwards in the room next door, where we will have something to eat, something to drink, and to toast to the launch of the dataset. So if you have a bit more patience, I would now like to introduce our last guest speaker, who is holding a closing statement for us. Our last guest is Jordi Bakker. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Mr. Bakker is the director of the Open Society Initiative for Europe and the Foundation's regional office, who are also financing the second part of the Latino Project, which is just going to start in the next couple of days and weeks, and which we are very excited about. And we are very grateful for their support, and we are very looking forward to your closing statement, Mr. Bakker.
Thanks. Yes, and I guess that's the good news, which is this isn't the end of Latino. It's not a data set that's out there for every one of us to criticize the methodology and all the problems and all the things that we would like to see, but actually it has a future. Let me first say a couple of things. The discussion that was just starting proves how brave the Latino team has been, because just to enter into this minefield of saying we're going to cover the region, we're going to, call things innovation, call other things not innovation, 76 in Guatemala, 130 in Costa Rica, and all this, which in each and every one you will get into trouble. People will say, why, why this yes, why this no. It's very brave, and it's very important, because science is about getting out of the detail and being able to tell a picture. And there's the beginnings of this, and we who are not a science funder, the Open Society Foundations, right? We're not generally into funding basic research and other things, still see the value in this high level of abstraction and in this 18% responsiveness versus, I'm inventing it, 22% accountability and all this. There is a value in this, and there's stories behind that help us go forward. The next phase that we're also going to support has a lot to do with some of the things you all probably crave as much as I did, which is, give me the detail. Tell me more about the stories. Give me examples. Show me how it worked, how it didn't. Don't only give me this. That's some of the things that can be done, right? Because the data are there. There's a lot of data to be exploited from the point of view of visualization, communication, detail for the research agenda. So we're going to be supporting that. And we're going to be supporting something which is what explains my presence here as the director for Europe of OSF, which is a little bit of an extension to Latin Europe, to Portugal, Spain, and Italy. And why Latin Europe? Not only because we don't speak good English, and so we go to Latin America because we think it's very interesting, because we don't understand the rest of the world, but also because a lot has happened in Southern Europe during the crisis, in many ways. There's been a lot of innovation, and I don't know if this is a sign of strength or of weakness of our democracies. It may be that our institutional mechanisms were too weak and we had to innovate a lot, or it may be that our civil societies were strong enough to react and in some ways process the situation. Either way, a lot has been going on. I think it's interesting to do this deliberate connection, for once south-north rather than north-south, which has been so many times the direction. I came to this whole project and to this discussion with a very strong prejudice, and I'm strongly prejudiced against the word innovation. I think because of business on the one hand, and the glorification of innovation in business, and marketing and advertising, which tends to glorify anything that has to do with youth, and all the values that are connected to youth, like novelty or innovation. Innovation in general tends to be overrated in our societies. And I have a strong prejudice when everyone tells me innovation as something good. I think we've all seen enough to see that this prejudice is more than dispelled by the approach, by the very clear conceptualization, what is meant by innovation here. This is not just a gratuitous fancy word. It's what is it that it implies. And I still have the question of whether we're talking about transformative actions of representative democracy, or we're talking about vitamin supplements of representative democracy, and probably will be different things in different places. There is, in any case, I think something which hasn't been mentioned much, and I really want to mention, perhaps in connection with the reference that was made to China just a minute ago, which is one thing that I always find striking about representative democracy is the contrast with almost every other field of social life in terms of how little it has evolved with technology. In its very basic mechanisms. And to me, the fact that if I write to Nike and tell them my shoe hurts here and the color is not very nice and it's they're wearing too quickly, they will be super interested in this, and they will spend time maybe answering me, but mostly processing this information. And our representative democracies are, in many cases, outside electoral periods, autistic to the citizens and the voters. In many, sorry about autistic, that's a bad word, but not very good at empathizing and learning from the citizens. I think that's very striking, taking into consideration the possibilities of technology. The Chinese government, partly for the wrong reasons, mostly maybe for the wrong reasons, has a massive system of petitions. If your local school board is terribly corrupt, you write there. And there's lots and lots of people in Beijing who take action following these petition sites. There is nothing like this in any Western democracy in that scale. Now, part of it is, of course, surveillance of the Chinese government. If you say too much about government, then you get into trouble. But part of it is the way they actually listen to people, because they don't have elections, they have other mechanisms. The fact that Western democracies use technology to spy on us and surveil our phones so massively, but then they can spend the same energy in these other things is, I think, immensely frustrating. And I didn't hear this mentioned, but I think there is also a lot about this. There's insatisfaction with representative democracy in itself, but also, I think many of us say, but there is such a world of possibility that simply wasn't there 20 years ago. Where is it in our everyday governance? We've heard a lot about what innovation is for in your presentation, Tammy, which was, I think, very enlightening. I wanted to say a little bit about what Pedro started, which is the current context, also bring it to Europe, which is also pretty dire in many ways, and then say what innovation is against. So why, what is it a reaction to? And it's, of course, a reaction to poor delivery, where it is poor delivery of reducing inequality or taming globalization, or simply, political power serving economic power rather than the other way around. But that's obviously one of the reasons. There's the whole reaction to what an Irish politologist, Peter Mayer, called the hollowing of democracy. You can call it decline or many other things. The fact that this whole institutional architecture is being hollowed of the most important thing of all, which is people's trust, people's hopes, people's ability, people's willingness to be part of it. That's less and less present in many democratic contexts. Many people check out of the system altogether. I'm personally more worried about those who check out, those who check under Marine Le Pen or other leaders, right? And checking out has become a big part of many of our democracies. And of course, there is the authoritarian populist inroads. In this context, something like Latino, but also the use that we can make of this, because a data set, it's not going to give you policy solutions, but the uses you can make of it, the further, let's say, development of a lot of the information that's there has to do with, of course, learning and replicating success. But to me, it's much more important to learn from failure. The Open Society Foundations, one of the things that we do is we're spending quite a bit of money against the big pharma to force big pharma to make public their failures. A lot of money, especially public money, is being spent on failures that have already happened somewhere else. Right? The big industry doesn't disclose their failures. Failure in innovation is much more important almost than success. Success, you hear about it, you see it. And learning from what didn't work is hugely important. That's why you want them all in the data set. That's what you then want to interrogate, as someone was doing already now. But what happened? It didn't give results, yes, but you need to know it happened and it failed. Because otherwise you would only hear about Porto Alegre forever. I mean, with all due respect, and with my love to Rio Grande do Sul, but there's so much more that has happened, and so much more that has resulted in capture, that has resulted in disappointment, that has resulted in no change. Let's learn from this, because if you don't have this in the data set, if you only learn from the best practice, this kind of another kind of managerial technocratic best practice, success cases, benchmarks, and all this, I think there's a lot that we're missing. There's missions to be accomplished, and now I'm talking about someone whose job it is to work for what we call open society. Not democracy, open society, which to me goes a bit beyond. And there's missions which have to do with reconnecting angry voters and passive citizens, but also a difficult one, we're at a time where, at least I believe, both in Europe and in Latin America, that protecting open society at many times is the difficult line between protecting worthy institutions that need protection, but not defending a status quo that's often not acceptable. And that line is incredibly difficult to thread. And that's where you need to be creative and innovative, and that's where these small tweaks are indispensable of representative democracy, because representative democracy isn't responding, it's not good enough, the status quo is not addressing, for example, the challenges of globalization. But if you start undermining the independence of the judiciary, or undermining free press, or other things, then you get into a much worse place. And just to say that some of the most innovative, constitutionally creative governments in Europe in the last 10 years have been those of Russia, Turkey, or Hungary. That's where a lot of constitutional innovation has been happening, right? The Hungarian constitution is the most plastic in Europe, right? We've been changing it so much time. We see these cases now, Serbia, where prime minister becomes president, becomes prime minister again, a la Putin and Medvedev, all these things, right? So innovation has to happen, if nothing else, because someone else is doing it already, without an open society agenda, with a very deliberate intention of really corroding the foundations of open society. So this is a tool, Latino, as a database and as a project. And it's a tool to understand these challenges beyond naivete. It's not because it's good, or because people promoted it, or because it was done with good intent, or because it ticks all the boxes of good words, right? Inclusivity and minorities and all this. It's not because of that the results are going to be good. I think it's also, it also brings us beyond ideological prejudice, which is very important in polarized places like Latin America nowadays, or many parts of Europe. That's really needed to go beyond, I'm ready to condone what my people do, and I'm not ready to condone what the others, right? And my people could be Marine Le Pen, or could be Emmanuel Macron, but we would condone almost anything from them if they're our people. And finally, and for me very important, it helps us to go beyond Eurocentrism, right? This is not the only place, Europe is not the only place where we have big questions about representative democracy. Some other people are having very big questions too. Maybe we can learn with them, if not from them. So we have a tool which is very useful, which is going to develop a little further, which we're going to be supporting, thanks to everyone who participated in this. It's a tool which I think helps us do a massively important mission, which is to ensure that representative democracy, with all its faults, with little evolutions, remains the best guarantee of open society, right? That it doesn't become the tool to actually distort and undermine open society. This is a massively political reading that I'm doing here. This is not what the project says, but I do think there is a political reading, and you are starting already with the political reading, so I'm taking the challenge. Scientific tools in political science also are useful for these things, in addition to having their own value, which of course we respect. And one of the things that why this project is successful is because it isn't a political project. It's an academic, serious, systematic, methodological sound project, for which I once again congratulate all the authors. Thank you.